As Americans, we've been blessed to have one of the greatest of two countries in the whole history of the world, Israel and the United States. They were both set up based on godly principles. If you look at our Declaration of Independence, you'll very quickly see a statement. It basically says, all men are created equal and endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and property. That's the foundation for our Constitution. Going to the principles, God has given us many rights. Those three are only a few among many. We are able to institute local governments and give them some of our rights in order to accomplish things we couldn't do very well on our own. Local police, firemen, perhaps building roads, courts to settle disputes, things of that type. Local governments set up state governments. State governments have their own responsibilities. In this nation, as it was set up in our Constitution, those states were independent countries, loosely working together through a federal government, and the states gave the federal government certain, basically 5 requirements, 5 things the federal government was to do that the states couldn't do as well. Number 1, the federal government was to adjudicate justice on the high seas. Obviously, no single state could do that very well. They were also to organize a defense against invasion. Now that's an invasion of people coming into the country illegally, immigration, or perhaps the attack of a foreign army like in 1812. Even though the states were responsible for recruiting and training the soldiers, it was the federal government that was tasked with organizing them and using them as a cohesive unit in the defense of the country. Obviously, it's better for the all the states to work together to defend any portion of the country that's attacked than that portion to defend itself alone. The government was also responsible for honest money and honest weights and measures. You'll find that's a biblical principle. In addition, the federal government was charged with making the commerce between the states to be free and fair, so that one state could not punish other states or individuals from other states with tariffs and taxes and all kinds of things that are unnecessary and improper. The federal government was also tasked to punish people who would commit treason or who would commit sedition. That was really it. There was really nothing else the federal government was to do. The federal government was designed to be a servant to the states and to the people. All rights, all God-given rights were reserved to the people, and again, only the limited things that the state and federal governments were allowed to do by the people, the federal government and the states both being servants of the people, that's the way we were constructed. Now, there were many measures that were taken to protect us. For instance, a king has the ability to create laws and to enforce those laws, to make taxes, to raise armies, and to declare and conduct wars. It's too much for any individual. So our government, as you know, was separated into 3 separate entities. The first branch is the legislative branch, which is the most important. The congressman in the House of Representatives represented the people. That's the only place where bills involving money can be produced. The Senate, which was designed to protect the states, was the one to ratify all treaties. A treaty was not to be superior to the Constitution, but it was to fall within the purview of the Constitution. Now, the House of Representatives was elected directly by the people because they're the people's representatives. A protection that was given to us was that the senators were elected from the state legislatures. They were appointed to go to Congress by people who knew them personally and knew that they were good, patriotic, honest Americans. The fact that it wasn't a political thing, there was no political campaign, put this in the control of Americans, because the Americans, if they didn't like their senators, they could unelect their representatives at a state level and fix the problem, because they knew and were neighbors to the people who were in the legislatures close by. The president was elected through electors. Each one of the state houses would pick 3 men, electors, who were good, solid citizens, not politicians, who knew the people in the state who were capable of running a government and doing it in a proper way. Those people, the electors, would then choose 3 people. Only one could be a favorite, from their own state. Each state would then send those names to Washington, where they'd be tallied. The person candidate with the most votes would be the president. That's how George Washington was elected president. The second would be the vice president. In that way, the people again had control of the presidency. There were no political parties, there was no need for one. And more than that, it's almost impossible to elect a president over a nationwide venue and for the normal person to know anything about that person's character or his capabilities. But by controlling the presidency from the local level, we had a great deal of security. The judicial branch was chosen in a combination between the federal legislators and the president. And they were chosen for life as long as they performed what they called good behavior. So they were there for life, so they wouldn't be influenced by political issues. But if it turned out that they were corrupt in some way, they could be eliminated, and that was an important feature. Now, there were no direct taxes for Americans. That was another one of the safeguards in our Constitution. If the federal government wanted to do something within its purview, those 5 things I mentioned, then they would basically develop a budget to determine how much it was going to cost to do whatever that might be. Then they would proportion those taxes among the various states, and it was the responsibility of the states to develop that money and pay for that particular project. That gave the states the ability to veto any project that they weren't willing to raise the money for, and more than that, it kept the federal government out of the affairs of individuals. They had no right, no warrant to do so. In addition, the senators who were in charge of protecting states' interests, the senators would fight against unnecessary costs, against unnecessary expenditures, and that kind of kept a check on the balance sheet for many, many years. There was another protection that I haven't mentioned at this point. Because the federal government is the servant of the states had and still have the right to nullify any unconstitutional law that's put together by the federal government. There is the ability within the Constitution to hold a constitutional convention and change elements of the Constitution itself. That's a dangerous procedure. The most effective procedure is what they call the Article 10 ability to nullify these unconstitutional laws. And that's an issue that will be coming up in future discussions. The upshot is we had checks and balances at every level in government, including the 3 branches of government at the federal level. The federal government was the servant of the states were the servant of the people. The government was created so that people had the right to believe whatever they wanted to believe, freedom of religion being an important one. That freed people to do what they thought was in their best interest. And in order to succeed, they had to do things that were worthwhile for other people. That's the origin of free enterprise. We had the most wonderful system in modern times of any country in the entire world. A great blessing. There are going to be 3 or 4 more discussions that will come in the future to show how, in various ways, these freedoms that were established so beautifully have been robbed from us. It's important to understand what we have, and I've tried to share that briefly with you today. It's also important to understand what has gone wrong so that we can do something to return to the freedom this nation once enjoyed and has largely lost. So please look for those future discussions. I'll first start with the Congress, which is the most important of the 3 federal divisions, then the President, then the Supreme Court. And then, if appropriate, I'll also talk about the money, which is also a responsibility of the Congress, but has enormous implications for our lives and freedom and for the morality of the country. Thank you. I hope you find that this was a worthwhile discussion.